Lecture 12, talking about platforms, really, because platforms, thanks Liam, is that platforms have been, are synonymous with digital technologies. They're not a new thing, it's just the way that the platforms have been constructed with the use of ICTs. But unusually, platforms and platform businesses have started to take on different kind of characteristics that makes them unusual, but also makes them very potent in our economies and in our businesses. Not surprisingly, a lot of the biggest valued companies are all platforms, digital platforms. But I will argue that more traditional businesses are taking on the characteristics of platforms and are becoming like platforms. And I use Walmart as an example. Now, Walmart might not necessarily be something that you would originally think as being a platform, but when you strip away the retail and into it, it very much is a platformed business that sits underneath it. And of course, you'll well be aware of is that Walmart is, at least by revenue, the largest business on the planet. So I think there's some interesting things that we can identify as being part of Walmart, but synonymous with this concept of being platforms. Now, platforms itself are becoming so important in our economies and in our societies is that it's given rise to a phenomenon regarded as being platformization, the platformization of society, where we all rely upon platforms, from things like your smartphones and so on and so forth, is that everything's done through the platform itself. To the extent that you can get very strong ties between the platform, the business itself, and the state, so that the platform becomes sort of so integral, so deeply intertwined in everything that we do. You get you get this phenomenization, this relatively new phenomenon that has been referred to as platformization. From a business and an international business perspective, as I'll argue that platforms are monopolies, but not only are they monopolies in terms of monopolizing the consumer base, but they are also behaving like economic monopolies as well, which has given them huge amounts of power. And that has caused a number of different issues that have arisen just more recently. And I'll comment upon those as well, and this is kind of like a precursor to this afternoon's lecture, where I'll talk about something which is known as prosumption, in that the digital economy has created a new category where you've got production and consumption, and they've been co-joined together to create this phenomenon known as prosumption. We are all prosumers. We produce and we consume online. So for today's morning's, or this afternoon's earlier lecture, is that I want to get across to you an understanding of what the platform is as a business model. Now, business models are also interesting because hitherto we haven't yet talked about business models, but again, pretty much every business talks about their business model. So what is it? What do we mean by business model, and what's different between business models and strategies and so on and so forth? But platform is a form of business model in my view. And then understand the linkages between big tech and platforms, and then understand the implications of platforms in the wider context, platformization, and monopolies and monopoly power. That's what I want to get across today. So let's start then with, what is a business model? Well, there's an awful lot written about business models, but the definitions, broadly speaking, are not that clear. But when we look at them more generally, we could say that they're a market device that help deal with uncertainty. Now, it's not clear to me as to whether or not we're dealing with a Keynesian form of uncertainty or just risk. and to act in order to be able to prescribe future changes. It's a model to follow. It becomes the exemplar, the example, and an illustration of best practice, a recipe or patterns to be instantly enacted in particular contexts. It can also be an expression of strategic intent, enabling exploration of a firm's value and competitive advantage. And it can also provide a series of stories that provide a narrative in order to be able to capture the firm's reason for being. The business model can be all of these things. Now, Matt Salverson might well say that when the definition of something is stretched to the point where it becomes all-encompassing, it means nothing. And the business model itself, or the concept of a business model, lacks definition or clear definition and specificity, but that doesn't stop people using it, in that most businesses will refer to their business model, but their business model could be any one or more than one of these particular things. And I think that the problem is that the concept of the business model itself is taken from lots of different basic theories and literatures. So information technology is included in there, strategy, organizational theory. And then all of this is combined with a lack of a lack of uniform approach, which means that the business model encompasses pretty much everything. And I think the real issue here is that what differentiates the business model from a strategy? Or is the business model a strategy in of itself? And I think that despite the fact that you've got so many differentiated concepts of talking about business models and so on and so forth, however, it will be impossible to deny its existence, because virtually every firm talks about its business model. And therefore, we couldn't deny its significance either, because they're everywhere. And increasingly, it's seen as a theoretical abstraction to fit a company's structure or its architecture, a theoretical construct broken into a series of different components. Increased emphasis on the strategic dimension as opposed to the purely operational dimension. Thus, the strategic components have gained heightened importance. So you need to have a business model because it identifies your strategy. The boom of the tech economy leads to a particularly increased use of the business model. In fact, the business model has become synonymous with tech industries itself, particularly in the business media, where business media will try and identify the business model of a particular, let's say, fintech firm against another fintech firm and try and differentiate out what it is in that business model that makes that firm successful. The definition of a business model is murky at best. Most often, it seems to refer to a loose conception of how a company does business and generates revenue, yet simply having a business model is an exceedingly low bar for building a company. That makes sense, doesn't it? The business approach to management becomes an invitation for faulty thinking and self-delusion. In other words, what's the real use or value or utility of the business model? Or does the business model itself become a convenient vehicle in order to be able to express a narrative that allows the firm to talk about its own wealth or its own value, the value that it incorporates, the value that it delivers, and how it goes about doing it? Whoops. Concepts of business models have gained a lot of attention over the last 15 years. Growth of the term corresponds to widespread utilization of the internet. As a term of art, and like art itself, it's one of those things that many people feel they can recognize when they see it, particularly if it's a new and clever one, but can't quite define it. And Margetta, who is one of the big hitters in strategy that you'll learn in other courses, I'm sure, claims that the business model is at heart stories that explain how enterprises work. But they're all very loose definitions. Now, within our own cultural economy view, where narratives drive value, we can see how the business model can be so important when effectively what we're doing is that we're looking at stories that explain how the enterprise works and how it delivers value. But it's not very satisfactory as far as I'm concerned. So we should build upon this. Now, very interesting and influential work. It was a textbook, actually, you might well come across during the course of your studies, by Julie Froud of the university and her colleagues. they wrote this book called Narratives and Numbers, within which it's asserted that senior leaders are required to bridge the gap between market expectations and the realities. So if the market expected you to grow by 10%, but the underlying economy is growing at 2%, is that there's a gap between expectations and reality, and that needs to be explained. If it's explained satisfactorily, then share price is stable or may even grow. If it isn't, then share price can be very much put at risk. But building upon the work of Julie Froud and her colleagues, they talked about a contributor by the name of Damor Doran explains recently how tech businesses have used stories in order to be able to increase their value. And we've seen that through the lecture series with the likes of, say, I don't know, well, all of them really, but probably more forcibly Tesla more than anything else. Although I was struck recently by an article in FT Unhedged about a new car company, electric car company has just gone on to IPO, and that car company, I think it sold. They specialize more in lorries and trucks than anything else. They'd only sold 20 cars or 20 trucks in the previous year, and yet at IPO it's now valued as more than General Motors, which is just incredible, isn't it, when you think about it? A startup worth more than a company that sells over 250,000 cars a year. Part of the story relates to technological innovation and disruption of the status quo. As an example, we've talked about this before, Wirecard, but Wirecard was phenomenally successful in raising money on the back of its claims of technological advance, technological innovation, and its business model. But actually, when it was a house of cards, because in effect, what happened to Wirecard was that it was making promises beyond its balance sheet, and that it lost quite a considerable amount of money, but claimed that, you know, it hadn't lost it. It was ultimately a fraudulent activity. But that's not the important point. The important point was the success of something like Wirecard based upon its business model of technological advance, and how successfully that was greeted by others. And then you can shift, therefore, the nature of the business model itself to this kind of definition, which is taken from Adam Lever's work, probably over 10 years old now, but it's not really widely accepted as a definition of a business model. And yet, to me, it's got much more sense than anything else that's ever been written out there, because it identifies two critical aspects of the business model itself. Is that one is that how you achieve financial viability. In other words, cover your costs. Value creation and capture are essences of the business model, how you create value and how you capture value. But also, and this is the integral bit to it, is that how you satisfy the chief stakeholder concerns. So lots of the business models and definitions of business models that we've seen before have all been things like stories about business strategies and so on and so forth. But this one encapsulates the nature of the business itself, where finance has become the core element of it. Particularly for those businesses that are now listed, where their stakeholder, the chief stakeholder concern, is of course shareholders. And so empirically, this definition here has got much more transferability than many of the others that we've seen before. And I would argue generalizability. It matches across the piece. Is that even if the firm is not listed, chief stakeholders are likely to be those people who have lent it money. And the business is only ever likely to stay viable so long as it can convince its chief stakeholders that the business creates and captures value. But finance is the core element, and it's devoid from many of the other definitions that we've talked of before. And so this brings us on to platforms, and platforms are interesting because of the fact that they are so integral to the way that we do things nowadays. But also is that successful platforms have demonstrated how they capture and how they create value, but have also dealt with their chief stakeholder concerns, even at times when they've not been making money. Now, you think about Amazon, it took Amazon a long time before it started to make any profits. It was always turning over a fair chunk of money, but it was burning through money like nobody's businesses. But the business model, the supporting stories that connect to the business model between expectations and realities, convinced chief stakeholders, i.e. those that were lending it money, or its stockholders, that good times were around the corner. And it was able to do this year after year after year after year after year. Quite phenomenal, really. And where platforms have encapsulated a sensible business model around creation and capture of value and maintaining their chief stakeholders, they have grown exponentially and become so significant within our economies today. But what are they? What are when we're talking about platforms? Well, platforms are digital infrastructures that enables two or more groups to interact. So in other words, a platform is an intermediary. So any bank, an online bank that deals just as a infrastructure that enable people to interact, whether it be savers and borrowers, savers and borrowers, they are intermediaries, they're platforms. Okay. So platforms act as intermediaries between customers, advisors, service providers, producers, suppliers, and even physical objects. And the eBay is a platform, is that you can put goods up to sell, be sold on eBay, and somebody like me might come along and buy them, or you for that matter. But they're monopolies, and I think this is what's the important thing, is that the platform itself is a monopoly. Is that once you exist, or once you are contained within Facebook's environment, you can only communicate within Facebook's environment. And Facebook, therefore, is competing with other monopolies for your attention. Yeah, you can't communicate out of Facebook into YouTube, as an example. It's difficult to communicate outside of the Apple architecture and bring in something else from outside, like, unless it's been sponsored by Apple. It's like Microsoft's packages are, sponsored by Apple. And then as a consequence of that is that Apple control its environment very, very strictly. Designers got to buy a kit from Apple in order to be able to create their apps. It is Apple that decides which apps go onto the Apple store, and what the price is going to be, and indeed what your earnings are going to be. There's a very strong sense of monopoly control. So platforms are both intermediaries and they're monopolies. Now, we don't mean monopoly, I think, in the strict economic sense, but I do mean monopoly in that they monopolize people's time and attention by controlling the architecture. And if you've ever been, if you find yourself within a particular environment, it's very difficult to get out of it. And I think I've said to you before, I bought my first iPhone in 2008. And I have a love-hate relationship with Apple, in that I'm talking to you on an iMac sitting on my desk. Well, just there to my left is another iMac, and it doesn't work anymore because Apple don't support that one. And in my bedroom, I've got another iMac. And I've got an iPhone here, and so on and so forth. And every time one of these things go down, I think about getting something else. But then you just think, but then I've got to move everything across my ID, my Apple ID, into another environment. And it's very difficult because it's time consuming and probably quite tricky as well, because now I understand the way that Apple works. I don't necessarily understand the way that the Microsoft work system. In fact, I positively loathe what's it called, the Microsoft operating system 10, Windows 10. And yet, when you look at them, Windows 10 alongside the Apple iOS, they're very similar. but they behave very, very differently. The languages are very, very different as well. The language within the Microsoft world, Windows 10, is just completely alien to me. So I'm stuck with it. A monopoly, and a monopoly. And it's a monopoly which is reliant upon the network effect. In other words, the more people that use it, the more valuable the platform becomes. And the network effect, I'll talk about and explain the network effect in a minute. And it embodies a degree of politics because of the fact that in order to stay within that environment, you've got to agree by the rules. Let's take as an example Trump in Twitter. Finally, they managed to eject him after years and years of invective and falsehoods and so on and so forth. So in order to stay, you've got to actually abide by the rules of the products and the service, and you can't alter it and shift it. You can't design it so that it's you. The best thing you can do is change the way that it looks, but ultimately it's the same thing. You can do something cosmetic to it, but that's about your lot. And the platforms own the software and also, in many cases, the hardware as well. So the software, the source codes, the algorithms that are used, and the hardware, the servers, the data centers, and in some respects, the smartphones, because the smartphone comes tethered to a particular network. So platforms are, in my opinion, the ultimate business model, is that they describe how you can create and capture value, but also the platform, because of the intermediate nature of what it does, is very good at dealing with the chief concerns of its stakeholders, investors, consumers, and so on and so forth. We use and buy Apple products because we like the way that Apple products look and feel. The functionality of them, although I have to say the functionality of Apple are crap now in comparison to the way they used to be. And I don't understand because it's interesting, isn't it? Is that you've developed the technology and the software, and yet it's less functional than it used to be. And that might well be just my experiences of it. I don't know, but I doubt it. And platforms are predicated upon this network effect and the sharing economy. And the idea about a sharing economy is that we get rid of, we reduce idle capacity throughout the whole of the supply chain, or extend the supply chain into the home. Idle capacity might be a bedroom, time that I've got, I could drive. And if I'm going to drive with an Uber, I'm controlled and constrained within the platform. Uber itself is a platform. It determines what the consumer does, where you get picked up, how much you're going to pay. Well, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it also controls the driver. Now, how much the driver gets paid and the route that they're going to take in order to get you from A to B. So in such a relationship, it's not exactly clear what's being shared. There's not a lot of sharing going on, actually, is there? Because it's all done for money. So the concept of sharing is probably being stretched a little bit, because the requirement by chief stakeholders is that it becomes commodified and monetized. A lot of the questions and concerns of new digital IPOs are, how will you monetize this app? That's the problem that Twitter has always had, is that how do you monetize Twitter? Because Twitter was such a small transactional device, texting device, is that where did you put the advertising that was in it? And even now, other smaller apps are struggling with the way in which they can commoditize the people that are sharing on it. But the idea of a sharing economy was really very interesting when you're talking to policymakers. Policymakers' ears pricked up. Oh, this is a new way of doing things. We're going to share things. So even when policy and regulation was being deliberately flouted, you could fall upon the fact, well, we're just sharing things here. There's no malice being done. And Google's original mission statement was to do no evil. And yet when it created Google Books, it just took people's work and just copied them straight into the Google architecture. but books are copyrighted. Well, Google didn't care. In fact, I'm not sure that they even really thought about it, because we're just commodifying this data so that it can be shared. What's the problem? Well, the problem was that authors who relied upon their books and the royalties they would make from them were denied that, because the book was now being digitized and was appearing on Google Books. And another example would be Google Maps, in that Google went around and photographed your house, your property, and so on and so forth, pictures from the sky. So if you're a criminal, you knew all the ways in and out of everybody's houses. Not a problem. But we're not doing any evil, they said. Do no evil. And in fact, Rana Faraha, who you'll have known by now, is that I'm quite keen as a commentator and as a journalist, wrote a book called Do No Evil. And it was about her stories about how she'd responded, or how she'd related to the digital businesses. In that her original degree was, or her original degrees actually, were in computing. And she was very sought after, to the extent that Google offered her an interview. But because Faraha would not sign a non-disclosure agreement, is that they wouldn't let her in the building. And so she actually was interviewed in the staff canteen on the bottom floor, which is kind of odd for a business that says we're not going to do any evil. Well, then why not be transparent about it? And of course, Google is not, they're not the only examples of firms that have transgressed other property rights in order to support their own platforms under the rationalization of the sharing economy. Business models employed often transfers the risk of employees with little consideration given to contracts, ownership, inspection, codification, insurances. So in other words, the business model transfers the risks directly to the employee, not the employer. So in the user Uber environment, and along with many of the other ones like Lyft and Didi, is that the risks are the employees, although they're not technically classed as being employees. There's a degree of legalese that's there as to whether people that actually drive for Uber are employees or subcontractors and so on and so forth. But the car is one's own. And if it gets smashed, then it's my insurances that pay for it, not Uber's. If a driver gets, a customer gets hurt while being in an Uber car, then it's the driver's insurances that are used, not Uber's insurances. So what's exactly being shared here in this sharing economy? And it's not clear as to whether or not this has resulted in greater efficiencies or less regulation. What it has effectively done is it shifted the regulation or moved it. So you get an element of re-regulation rather than anything else. So we've got some points. Okay, so could you say the same for Spotify, where smaller artists who relied on revenue from selling records now lose revenue due to their low costs and low return nature of their operations? I think Spotify is a really insidious beast. I'm a huge consumer of music and I use Spotify. But if you actually look at who makes the money on Spotify? It's all the big artists. And the smaller ones are in a long tail to the point where some will never ever be heard of. You know, they can put things on Spotify and it'll never crop up. But what does Spotify put into my feeds whenever I log on to Spotify? It tells me things that it thinks that I might be interested in, but a lot of it I'm not really interested in. As an example, I can't remember the name of the group now, but one of my favorite groups, I can't remember the name of the group of. They had a new set of songs out, which we call an album, but they're not an album anymore. They're just packaged under some design. But I didn't know anything about it. But I got lots of feeds about other stuff that I'm just not interested in. So, and low returns for artists. Yeah, absolutely. And I'll say something more about Spotify later on. Don't use Spotify out of protest. Yeah, I get that. And I kind of, I've fallen into a trap with it. Because I'm old enough to have bought all of the albums in the first place in plastic, 12-inch ones, in all array of different colours and so on and so forth. You know, sort of like limited green vinyl edition of Motorhead's Overkill when it first came out, and then got rid of them all. I gave most of them to my brother, actually. The rest of them I sold, and quite a substantial amount just chucked in the skip. And then I bought them again in CD form. And now I'm buying them again. Well, actually, there was something that was in between CD form and the streaming form, because I bought them as downloads as well in some cases. And then now I'm paying for them again as I'm streaming. So realistically, is that the bands that I enjoy have made a bloody fortune out of me, except the fact is that they haven't. Spotify's doing all right. It's worth pointing out that Spotify is not the only streaming service that's available to you, should you not want to use Spotify. I like its architecture, but it's a monopoly, isn't it? If it's not on Spotify, I can't listen to it. I have to go to something else to be able to do it. And it's a supposed just an intermediary between me and the artists that I care for. But it's not, is it? Because it derives a fee out of it. Well, it is an intermediary, but it's a fee-paying intermediary. It's not a sharing economy in that respect. But yeah, it's a good point. Spotify, a strange world that we're living in as far as Spotify is concerned, and music in general is concerned. Because the music itself is not tangible, is it? So it can appear anywhere and everywhere in the world. And as an example of why, I mean, why do you pay more for Spotify in Europe than you do in America? Because the regulations are different, the controls are different. And some things will not appear on Spotify Europe that do appear in America because of the fact that Spotify don't have the agreements yet. Platforms are not just social media businesses, it's a statement of intent, but platforms are not new. The platform model existed way before our current platform model. It's just that the technology has allowed the network effect, scale and scope in order for them to become huge. But in effect, just a cheap supermarket was a platform. The supermarket itself bought in goods from other people and sold them to consumers in a warehouse type environment. Pile them high, sell them quick. Newspapers are platforms. They're intermediaries between the news and the consumer. They don't necessarily have quite the same monopoly effect, though. Is that the news is the news, and different stories would be presented in different ways within newspapers themselves. And I could buy whichever one I wanted to that fell into line with the way that I perceived it too. And that's still very similar today, I suppose, in many respects. But you could get other news, and still can get other news. But nevertheless, is that the platform itself, or the concept of a platform, is not new. It's just that the way that technology has allowed the platform to actually engage itself within this digital kind of infrastructure and curtail people within an environment has given it such recognizable not superiority, but recognizable power, authority, and penetration within our wider economies. And in the ECT world, of course, the information technology world, it's reduced the need to own physical infrastructure and assets, because it's all done in the cyberverse. It's been rendered, our platforms have been rendered intangible. Whereas huge mass producing chains or mass producing car manufacturers were producing tens and hundreds of thousands of people. I think Facebook in London has got 4,000 people in total. That's all, which in terms of the mass producers and the mass employers of the past is very, very small. There's no need to own physical infrastructure and assets because it's all intangibly held upon a computer or a server somewhere. And the rise of the platform marks the stage, or the next stage. We're very much well into this, I think, now. It's not a next stage, it's the current stage in the digital economy. It's to the digital era what the factory was to the industrial era. It needs to be perceived in exactly the same way. The expression great transformation refers to Karl Polanyi. For those of you that are economics students and that you've not heard of Karl Polanyi or read any of his work, shame on you, because you should do. Because Polanyi is one of the very, very few socialist economists that makes any sense. He's a great writer, as is his daughter, for that matter. Now, I wouldn't advise anybody goes out and rushes out and buys The Great Transformation by Polanyi, but I would advise you that you did look at some of the summaries or the annotated versions of it, or even his daughter's collected talks and monographs based upon her father's work. But he's a very interesting character and a tremendous non-orthodox economist. It's a huge understanding about and actually in one of his earlier works is that one of the arguments that is that we shouldn't look at a socialist concept of economy because there's no examples of one ever working. Well, there is actually. Polanyi wrote about it because he wrote about Austria in the pre-First World War, when it was a very successful, socially democratic establishment. It's Vienna, really, rather than Austria, if I was to be brutally honest. But there's only one. So yeah, but then my argument would be is that while socialism is a utopian ideology, so is free market capitalism. It's another utopian ideology. Something which is pragmatically orientated that sits in the middle is probably the best of both worlds. Well, the great transformation is using Polanyi's phrase, but platforms are extremely powerful organizers of enormous swathes of economic activity, and as a consequence, society. There is a great transformation, a second one. Polanyi predicted the rise of the financialized economy. The new great transformation outlines the shift of the digital infrastructure and the way that it's a digital grand transformation or great transformation. The mega platforms, when you put them all together, are all valued over 1 trillion. In fact, some of them now, Amazon and Apple, are worth over 2 trillion. Not quite sure that Google's quite there yet. And I realized as well is that I'm going to have to go through and change all my slides now because Facebook's now metaverse or meta, isn't it? Whatever that is. Because is that a narrative device in order to actually persuade people about the value of Facebook, particularly as it's been going under quite a lot of pressures and strains related to the way that Facebook delivers its business model? It wouldn't surprise me. Market development is based upon an increased commodification. So every time you get a shift in the technology, it always brings about another or a higher level of commodification of all sorts of different inputs and outputs. And the big platforms are reach approximately 3 billion people, both globally and locally. And I think that number again is outmoded now. I think it's probably a lot higher than that. But Polanyi referred specifically to the commodification of labor, when actually what we're talking about now in this great transformation is the commodification and monetization of data, as we talked about before. The more data the platforms accrue through its users and its ability to monetize it through advertising, is how they make their substantial amount of their profits. Apple is unusual. It sells quite a lot of hardware relative to others, but Amazon sells no hardware. Microsoft does, fair enough. Facebook doesn't. Google, a little bit, but not much. Oops. So some of the biggest online platforms have a user base on par with populations of the world's most populous countries. Facebook's got 1.5 billion users, which is more than the population of China, more than the population of India, at least at the time of these slides anyway. YouTube has got 1 billion users. WhatsApp has 1 billion users. I mean, interestingly, WhatsApp and Facebook have got the same parent company, but you can't communicate even across WhatsApp into Facebook. Not that I'm aware of anyway. But a lot of people are signed up to these things. That's the point that we're making here. And whilst we talk about the market capitalization of the platforms in the West, we shouldn't forget actually that the Asian platforms reign supreme too, in that the largest Chinese platform is Tencent, with a market cap of just short of $700 billion. Alibaba, 630 billion, and so on and so on and so forth. Number 4 is beyond me in terms of pronunciation. I think it's Pinduoduo, but I'm guessing. But it's still got a market cap of over 200 billion, and yet it's limited and it's very small even within China itself. So the platform is not just something that is limited to America or to the UK or to Europe. It's a global. The Japanese have got their own platforms as well, but because of the problems relating to the Japanese language, of course, is that it's only transferable. It's not transferable out of Japan. Whereas English has got more transferability across the globe, because English has become synonymous with the world of business, I guess. The more people learn English as a consequence. That may change. Platform businesses are bringing together producers and consumers in high value exchanges. Their chief assets are information and interaction, which together is the source of the value they can create, and it's their competitive advantage. So that's how they create value. They capture the value because it's all contained within its own platform, and they look after their chief stakeholders, which in the case of these here would be its shareholders. And the platforms are the most valuable corporations on the planet. It's just figures that we've seen before. And this is a representation of the kind of like the same data, but I just thought it was interesting the way that this had been done when you look at a comparison between 2005 and 2020, is that all of the big firms, the market cap of the big firms in 2005, General Electric, Exxon, Microsoft, Citigroup, BP, Walmart, Royal Dutch Shell, Johnson & Johnson, all gone within the top now. In fact, General Electric is almost finished as a business per se. And the only one that is not a tech firm, and this is a recent interloper, and it's a somewhat unfair interloper into the world's biggest corporations, is the Aramco from Saudi Arabia. I mean, Saudi Arabia, or Aramco, beg your pardon, is part of the House of Saud's nationalized oil sector. Out of which, I mean, it's not all of it. They only floated off a proportion of it. And once they'd managed to persuade the various stock exchanges that they were legally entitled to float their shares, because there was an issue about ownership, is that you need to have a certain proportion of the shares that go onto a market in order for it to become viable within the exchange. And the House of Saud wanted to maintain ownership of 85% of the total shares, which meant to suggest that it wasn't really they weren't really selling the business, or a substantial chunk of it, is that they would always have control over the business and its share price. But anyway, the various exchanges decided to agree that this should be floated, because everybody could see that there was a lot of money to be made by owning Aramco shares. And they were right, in that Aramco is one of the big businesses right at the top there, right at the top. This is in 2020, and these were valuations before the pandemic. Post-pandemic valuations would put Apple and Amazon certainly higher than it is there now. Microsoft too. Phenomenal growth during the pandemic in terms of market cap. But these two charts just show you that we are living in the age of the platform big tech businesses. And it's pretty incontrovertible, really, I think. But it's a massive transformation. It is the great transformation of our era. We talked about the network effect, and really, I mean, this is a complex kind of like diagram, which is, unless you're really interested in this kind of stuff, and frankly I'm not, is just lots of modes and so on and so forth. But the network effect is that we could just explain the network effect by just referring back to Castells. In the space of place has been taken over by the space of flows between nodes, and that's all that these are on it. These are nodes, and it's a flow of data between the nodes that creates the network effect. In that, the more that the node shares, the more that other people will want to be part of that particular network itself. The phenomenon of say something like Facebook was because everybody was on Facebook. And my family in Singapore would always say, whenever we go back there, and say, "Why aren't you on Facebook?" So I don't want to be on Facebook. But you're missing out. Not really. But every business in Singapore, they didn't have a web page. It was all done on Facebook. And so if everything's on Facebook, you've got to be part of Facebook, which means that more people join. In order to get the benefits of getting the details, the information off Facebook, you've got to be a member of Facebook. And when you're a member of Facebook, is that everybody starts sending you stuff. Feeds, likes, and so on and so forth. It builds the business, builds the business, builds the business, or builds the network effect. So flows of data build the network. And we talked about this when I talked about Castells' work, as you know this, because building your own social media platform means that you have to be actively engaged in building a platform, your own profile. Right, welcome back. Trust you've all got your beverage of choice. I'm drinking neat whiskey. Cheers. No, it's coffee. Right, so Instagram's also Facebook. It is. And they've added cross-platform communication recently. Okay. And they also have WhatsApp. It doesn't make sense, yeah, but think about why they've got them. Is that Facebook bought Instagram because Instagram was extraordinarily popular. So you buy anything that's a perceived threat, or you can buy anything that's a perceived threat. WhatsApp was exactly the same thing. But there's different demographics that use Instagram and WhatsApp. Instagram is the environment of choice of younger people, whereas Facebook, it's old buggers use it, don't they? And Facebook has fallen out of popularity with younger people. Well, why not therefore populate the environments so that it's not one or the other, it can all be encapsulated within the same platform? And my guess is that it is trying to repopulate Facebook's interest amongst younger people, particularly as they start to talk about being in the metaverse rather than the Facebookverse. So the metaverse means that you're not going to have separate platforms that are all over there. You're going to have one metaverse out of which you can communicate across using different sorts of platforms, all controlled by Facebook as an example. So it's part of the the strategic plan, and it makes much more sense on the basis of that. Alphabet is Google. Yeah, it is. I don't know how you drink air. Just give you wind, isn't it? It's not a good thing. What will the essay be on in January? Where have you been? The paper is been, the essay is handed in January. The essay titles are already on Facebook or on Blackboard. They're not on Facebook. I do have a Facebook account, but I never use it, along with every other platform I've ever been stupid enough to sign up for. But it's already there on Blackboard. So find it. What will the 40 questions be in January? What, like I'm going to tell you what the questions are? Right, have you got a pen? Just write these down. There's not much of an exam, is it, if I tell you what the questions are? And I've told you before, they are on the lecture slides and the readings, which are identified on Blackboard. Now, this is also in the recording, and it's also on Blackboard, which indicates to me that a number of you are not spending any time at all on Blackboard. But I'm not going to answer any more questions about assignments and exams in terms of what is it supposed to be, because it's there. And it's been there for 2 or 3 weeks now. So go and find it. Right, let's move on. So platforms are this huge business model out of which is incredibly successful. But if we dig into this a little bit further and we become a little bit more critical about it, is that we could suggest that really platforms have circumvented regulations, particularly in the light of labour laws. Lyft, Uber and Amazon have all rewritten labour laws. Yeah, in terms of who or what constitutes an employee. It shifted that boundary, that definition of what they are. And they've come up with different terminologies for people as well. Not employee, but more like, I can't remember any of the names of what they call them, people. Associates. They're associates. And platforms, because of their nature, their intangible nature of what and who they are incredible, very adept at avoiding their own tax liabilities. The Silicon Six has paid $219 billion over 10 years, but that's on revenue of about 6 trillion, about 3.6% of it. Amazon on 1.6 trillion of revenue and $60.5 billion worth of profit has paid taxes of 5.9 billion. But according to the Fair Tax Foundation, they should have paid 10.7 billion. So it's only about 50% of their tax liability they're actually paying. And in the same analysis, the Fair Tax Foundation looked at the Silicon Six and said that over the period of the last 10 years is that the big tech businesses have managed to reduce their tax liabilities by $149 billion. Which is a lot of money for 6 firms. Platforms undermine existing institutions, all in the name of disruption. And that's a good thing. We say we're disrupting the status quo, making things different, innovating, changing it, making it more dynamic. But actually, it undermines valuable institutions, such as authors, by co-opting their work and making it publishable without permissions. Newspapers. 40% of all Americans, I think it's more than 40%, it might be 50%, I think it's 40% of Europeans, I think it's more, 40% of Europeans and more, I think, of Americans get their news from Facebook exclusively. Hotels been undermined because of Airbnb. Taxi firms and their associated regulations is that in order to become a taxi driver in London, as an example, one needed to pass a test called the knowledge, so that you knew how to get from A to B. Well, an Uber driver doesn't need to do that. And they don't need the same kind of licenses in terms of taxi licenses, which are very expensive. Well, actually, they do in London now because they changed the regulations that's in there. But I don't know if you saw recently, but the chief executive of Uber is in London talking to Sadiq Khan about how London will shift its regulatory base in order to free up space for Uber. And all of this is done under the banner of disruption. Disruption is a good thing, they say. Well, I guess that disruption is a good thing, but only if the rules or the game is the same. Why should a cab have to pay £20,000 a year for a cab's license, taxi license in one particular city, but Uber drivers or Uber pays nothing for a license? Because one has got to make at least 20,000 before it starts to make a profit. The other one makes a profit almost immediately. And the argument here is that you get a datafication and therefore a commodification of all social relationships that appear within a platform. Your relationship has now got economic value. It's a commodity. The economic encroaches upon the social. Let's give you an example, which is maybe a little more of an abstract example of a platform, because we've talked about the big tech platforms. But as you well know, is that over the course of the lecture series that I've identified banks as being digital businesses, because the nature of what they deal with, finance, money, is digitized, exists in a cyberverse. Online banking is becoming more and more popular. High street banks disappearing. The names exist, but they don't exist on the high street. Everybody banks through an app. They're digital businesses. And they're platforms. So you can easily see how banks as platforms exist as well. But what about something which is a little bit more abstract, a bit difficult? Can we apply the logic of the platform to retail businesses? And in this instance, I'm going to have a go at applying it to the concept of, well, not the concept, the realities of the firm Walmart, which you'll be aware of, but probably have never shopped in. I don't know. When Asda used to be Walmart in the UK, but it isn't anymore. Asda's now owned by a PE firm, I think, as far as I'm aware. But Walmart is a very, very large business in terms of its turnover and the amount of people it employs. So I'll present you a case study of Walmart, and you can make your own conclusions up as to whether or not you think it's a platform. So Walmart, this is what Walmart say that they do. This is their president and chief executive. In the end, all of this will make a difference in the lives of our customers by providing them with a quality product at a great price so they can save money and live better. Walmart are in the business of making it possible for people to live better. I suppose, providing that you don't take into account the guns that they sell. That's how it's done, supplier by supplier, item by item. Together we can do more. Let's dream big and work hard. This is one of the pictures of a Walmart corporate meeting. The narrative is there, giving the rational justification for the model. But Walmart's profits don't necessarily come through selling stuff. They do make a profit on selling stuff, but because they keep the prices artificially low, their margins are very, very tight. Where Walmart makes the majority of its money is on its ability to control prices and supplying through warehousing and distribution. It's a logistics business. And its logistics business is highly, highly digitized, computerized. It's a complete platform. And they have an odd kind of rationale, Walmart. Its history is sort of it doesn't come from a sort of like a normative kind of like business background. Walmart itself has been around for quite a long time, and it's successfully linked free market capitalism with concepts of evangelical Protestantism, the American church, in other words. And its corporate culture is claimed to be based upon women entering the work in support of the declining importance of agriculture. But it's probably more to do with women entering the workforce to support declining incomes. So Walmart's rational plan, its plan was that Walmart stores appeared in areas which were very conservative, paid low salaries to women in particular that would take part-time jobs within Walmart in order to actually try and support the concept of it. They would be supporting the notion of declining agriculture. But declining agriculture meant there was declining incomes and the women had needed to go out to work. In conservative households, that would have not been the norm. And because of the conservative nature of a lot of their workforce, where they originally started off, Ohio, Idaho, and places like that, is that there's an undercurrent of Protestantism or church. There's a high level of religiosity in the culture and the practices of Walmart. And they've used quite a lot of fake blogs to support the Walmart agenda. They've engaged quite a lot on social media in order to perpetuate the myths about themselves and about their own histories, and about where they came from and what they're doing, supporting people in order to make their lives better. And they are very puritanical in some areas, in that there's an awful lot of store-based censorship. Certain books won't get sold. 50 Shades of Grey would not be sold in Walmart. I don't think the Harry Potter books were originally sold in Walmart either. So they're quite puritanical, apart from selling guns, which is a bit odd, isn't it, really? But it fits very much within the concept of the American evangelical church. Guns are okay. Sex outside of marriage, abortion, that's not. Magic, anything which is seen as, even though it's fiction, that's seen as being against the true church, is something to be dissuaded away. And Walmart uses its position in order to convince people of the correctness of its messages, and it's the way that it uses social media and media more generally. It's a mobilization of American nostalgia, in other words, for a mythical white and mom and pop capitalism. It's an advocacy to a return to the US capitalism that never really was. It's very American, which is possibly why it doesn't transfer very well into foreign dominions. But with its sheer size, it shapes global flows of labor, commodities, information, and policy. It's a power beholden only to the dictates of its own profit and shareholder value. And it's driven by a single-minded pursuit of maximum efficiency. And in order to be able to achieve its maximum efficiencies, it has built an infrastructure of data and technology, which is unparalleled anywhere on the planet. There's an unprecedented array of technologies for data collection built on the back of its own discounted labor. The labor is less important than the technology. As an example, is that Walmart are able to monitor its own workforce down to half-an-hour increments. And if they make the decision that they've got too much labor or workforce on a store, is that they'll send people home. And it's that religious pursuit of efficiency. Too much labor here, start sending people home. So the technology determines the labor workforce. To the extent that people have referred to Walmart as being shop floor totalitarianism. The data, computers, determine what people do and where they should go, what stock should be put out, and so on and so forth. To the extent that actually 40% of its workforce is part-time, and 40% of that turns over on an annual basis. average worker in Walmart receives a state subsidy of over $2,000 a year, which is efficiency personified, because that means that that £2,000 does not need to be paid by Walmart. It's paid by the state. So Walmart in itself is a state subsidized technological enterprise in the pursuit of maximum efficiencies. It has a computer network which is unparalleled. It can shift 70 terabytes of data per second. Sorry, it shifts 70 terabytes of data annually, and it's second only in size to the Pentagon. So the only technological infrastructure or data infrastructure on the planet that's bigger than Walmart's is the Pentagon. Now, that's likely to have, the difference between the two is likely to have shifted because the Pentagon is now using Amazon's infrastructure in order to store quite a lot of its data, which is kind of bizarre, really, is that you're outsourcing state secrets or state data to a private sector corporation. It can track 680 million distinct products, 20 million customer transactions a day. It allocates labor to stores and warehouses, I've told you about. Made available to suppliers so they can also meet demand. So they get real-time messages about real-time demand. And it has a predictive technology which smooths the hyper-efficient machine. And it has a very complex array of RFID tags, in other words, electronic tagging of everything to manage the movement of goods from A to B. And they can literally track shipments of goods across the globe through using their data technologies. We keep watching everything, she says, she being some Walmart manager. We're pretty near real time. We can tell people that they need to go do something, and we're within hours, depending on the event. It's developed a predictive capacity. Exception management to develop intelligent network systems intervene, isolate in space as dissonant to the hyper-efficient operation of the system. What does that mean? Stores are automatically and remotely commanded to realign labor schedules, product lines, to move things around on shelves, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's demonstrated the complete knowability of its operations. It's the ultimate exploitation of a network, of network power. It manages flows of information, masters speeds and connections, distance and time, almost become an irrelevance because it's so efficient and quick. Now, when you go to Walmart, it doesn't look like that when you're in it. It looks like chaos, but it's damned efficient. It has ceiling mounted CCTVs that captures all activity. Prevention teams, but actually these are not theft prevention teams that are stopping customers from thieving. They are stopping workers from stealing. And they conduct threat research operations. Removal of certain items triggers automated cameras to monitor suspicious behavior. So when something moves, the cameras will target into it to see what's going on. The RFID tags can lock wheels on trolleys. So if somebody takes something outside of a store in a trolley, the trolley wheels will lock. And it can track those items for miles. And it can also monitor it can monitor staff moving the items as well. The security apparatus is derived from and/or is destined for military application. There is a close run. Linkages is like a revolving door between the military and Walmart. Its technology is military grade. Its security is military grade. Its retail operations look incredibly unsophisticated, but behind all of that, there is this remarkable computer network, computerized network. And Walmart uses technology in order to realize the themes of a concept which was explained by George Ritzer. I think it's 2006. It's quite an old book now. I've got it in here somewhere, but I can't remember where it is. But Ritzer's book on McDonaldization, it's called The McDonaldization of Society, is one of the 10 books that you should read while you're at university. Don't ask me what the other 9 are, because I make them up. They change all the time, depending on what I'm reading and what's influential to me at the moment. But Ritzer's book on McDonaldization of Society is always in there, because it's an amazing piece of work. And the digital infrastructure has allowed the McDonaldization concept to become more real. And what are the themes of the McDonaldization? And Ritzer's view is that businesses are becoming more like fast food restaurants, all of them. Highly efficient, with high levels of calculability and predictability, high levels of control, but also coupled with high levels of irrationality from certain perspectives. You could argue that universities are a bit like McDonald's. Highly efficient, calculable, predictable, high levels of control, and they're irrational as far as the students are concerned and as far as lecturers are concerned. Walmart is the ultimate McDonaldized building business, and it is backed up with a huge infrastructure of computer power and data generating power. McDonaldization, fascinating concept. Let's go back to Spotify and think about Spotify as well, because of the points that you raised about Spotify earlier on. Is McDonaldization also a concept of how American culture spread across the world? No, it isn't. There's a little element of it in there because the culture of the hyper-efficient business is Americanized, and that's spread across the globe, but not about American culture. There's an interesting book called, I think it's called Big Mac versus Jihad, Global Culture Wars. Something like that. That was an interesting exposition on culture. But also, I think in the reading list is that there is a book on globalization by George Ritzer. And one of the chapters is on culture. So if you want to, if you're interested in the sort of like the globalization of culture, is that would be a good place to, as a good jumping off point, because Ritzer is very, very good in these areas, very good. That's what you learned in sociology. Fair enough. I think that McDonaldization and McDonald's are two separate things. And I think that you might well have learned that McDonald's is a concept of American culture that's spread across the world, rather than Ritzer's definition of McDonaldization of society, which is his own conceptualization about hyper-rationality of businesses from a predictable, calculated sort of front, take all the risk out of it. So Spotify, despite its successes and its size and so on and so forth, actually now includes a button on it whereby I can make a donation to my favorite artist. Now, this has been this arose because the artists were complaining that they weren't making sufficient money from people listening to their music. So Spotify decided to address this, not by providing them with higher royalties, because in essence that's what artists earn, but providing the user with a button to make payments directly to the artist, which is kind of phenomenal, isn't it, really? Because that's the point of Spotify in the first place. But Spotify decided, well, no. We should be making the money out of this, not the artists, which kind of said, well, what did you get into doing this in the first place for? So you can make a contribution, but it's not unusual. Spotify, it's not unusual for the ability to make contributions towards contributors. So YouTube uses tip jars or Patreon accounts. donations that you can make. What's interestingly from the platform point of view is that the platform's not involved in the transaction between the artist, the consumer, and whoever the artist might be. They can hide behind its own intermediary status. So if you buy something crap or dangerous off Amazon, they'll say, well, it's not our problem. It's the supplier. But we'll, in Amazon's case, is that we'll deal with it for you, but we won't take any responsibility for selling you crap in the first place. Which is very clever, because they're not engaged in actually selling anything. We're just creating this environment so you guys can all sell it and work it out between yourselves. We just provide you with an infrastructure in order to be able to do it, which means that they're not liable for anything, which is clever and insidious in equal measure. Because where's the accountability? And this is the argument that Facebook have. So, well, you know, why should we monitor what people say? It's not our problem. We're just providing you with an infrastructure. Well, law has changed now, haven't they? They've said that actually, one of the big debates is to whether or not to treat Facebook and other messaging services and social media services as being publishers, which if you're a publisher, like a newspaper, then you're liable, and you could be accused of slander or libel, and you could be prosecuted. So there's been a slight shift in relationships, but it doesn't mean to say that they're not fighting back against that. And you'd have to argue fighting back against it quite successfully. But platforms are not involved in the transactions because we're intermediaries. We just provided the environment. Which brings us on to platformization, which is designed as a penetration of infrastructures, economic processes, and government frameworks on digital platforms in different sectors and spheres of life, as well as the reorganization of cultural practices around those particular platforms. It's the endemic utilization of platforms in all aspects of society. An inextricable relationship between online platforms and societal structures. Try functioning within society without engaging in a platform. I mean, it's possible, but it's difficult. And that's what platformization is. And it's argued that China is the most platformized economy on the planet. Now, I'm only reporting the story here because I'm not Chinese and I don't live in China. So I'm only reporting the work. But from those that I have, that are in either Hong Kong or Shanghai or across China, there is a degree of acceptance that this is the way that it works. But I think it's worth pointing out is that even though China might be seen as being the most platformized society on the planet currently, is that other economies are catching up very, very quickly. The difference between China and others is the engagement of the state, in that the state controls the platforms. The state is a stakeholder in the platforms too, and they don't like when platforms become too powerful and too independent. Hence, the charges levied against Alibaba most recently, and about the splitting of Alipay and AntPay and so on and so forth. So the state is a big player, which is different in China than it is in other parts of the world. And that's as a consequence of the unique structure of Chinese business. Chinese business is officially state socialized capitalism. It's not socialist, because under a socialist society is that workers own the means of production. Well, in China, the state, the Chinese party, owns the means of production. But it also allows private enterprise, capitalism, but takes an interest and a stake in it. Now, other societies do the same thing. Is that the French society, the French economy has got quite a lot of nationalized or naturalized French businesses. Singapore does it, in that Singapore's sovereign wealth fund, Temasek Holdings, owns shares in every private sector businesses in Singapore. So China's not unusual in that. It's probably just more forthright in the way that it does it. And there's been a rapid proliferation of platformization in China through Alipay, social credit systems, the datafication of Didi, Qixing, and third-party apps that are contained and corralled within WeChat. I don't know if any of you who are not from China that have attempted to use WeChat. I had a WeChat account because there were people in China that were very interested in beer, like I was interested in beer, and I was interested in what was going on in and around the breweries in and around Shanghai. And we stayed in contact through WeChat. But WeChat is not just a simple texting or messaging system. It's phenomenal in terms of all of the in-app things that are in there. It's a platform that grows like Topsy. It's amazing in terms of what it does. It has its own payment systems in it as well. It's incredible. It was too complex almost for me. I just wanted a simple chatting message. And I was getting notifications, all sorts of things coming up all the time. For those that have been brought up with it and have used it culturally for a long period of time, I guess it's almost like second nature. I mean, it's integral to life in China. Boundaries between platforms and the public infrastructure is increasingly porous. Platforms are part of everyday life. WeChat Pay, which I've just talked about, renders real money almost obsolete. But it's also a huge assistance to the banking system. Delivery workers directed by algorithms within Baidu, amongst others. And there's a general indifference due to monitoring anyway. Now, that might well be as a consequence of the Chinese state and the authorities of the power of the Chinese state, but there's a degree of acceptance from the population, which is not Chinese, is not unique Chinese in nature, is that this is also observable within the West, is that, well, what's the problem with being monitored if you're not doing anything wrong? I've got nothing to hide. Look away. Without thinking about the fact that your own data, your own privacy has now become commoditized because it can be used where you go, when you go there, how long you spend there, and so on and so forth. To the extent that you can go, in Singapore, you can go past shops and malls and you can get notifications of offers on your smartphone as you go past it. So it is similar to the US and Europe, but not quite as endemic. The distinction is the increased entangled nature between the corporation and the state. Accelerates and intensifies the process of platformations into every sphere of life. I can't pronounce that next word that's up there. Literally, I think its definition or interpretation of it is know your strong country. And it awards points and calculates your own personal scores. So it's kind of like an app which demonstrates your advocacy, support of the Chinese state, but you get rewards for demonstrating that. To the extent that workplaces and schools might demand a good score in order to be accepted there. And it's worth pointing out is that that app has got Google's fingerprints all over it as well, is that Google is working very, even though Google itself is not allowable within China, although that might have changed since the last time I was there, is that Google as a corporation works quite closely with the Chinese government in the development of smart cities and certain apps, of which Know Your Strong Country is reported to be one of them. Developed in cooperation with Alibaba, the Alipay system is embedded within its app. I've expressed that badly. That should just be talking about Alipay system embedded within the Alibaba app, although that has now changed because of the fact that they've been required to split. Structuring meaning, which promotes collaboration and participation. So you receive your data and information via the app, which has been structured in order to be able to make meaning. Does that make sense? It's filtered in a way that helps promote the cause of Chinese society. Doesn't mean to say that it is wrong or that it is inherently overtly totalitarian, authoritarian, or whatever it is. But whichever way you might define it, some people might say that it is, some people might say that it's quite liberal because it's beneficial, it's benevolent, and it has meaningful utility and purpose. But whichever way you look at it, it is an example of a Foucauldian panopticon. People are observed, observations are translated into data and narratives, which changes people's behaviors. Because positive behaviors are supported by apps such as Know Your Own Country, which allows you access to schools and to work and so on and so forth. So it's almost gone beyond the Foucauldian panopticon into something which might be described as an oligopticon, an omnipresent series of different panopticons that coalesce together into the ultimate platform. The examples there before us, that's what the future looks like. And all of this has been achieved under the message of disruption. Big tech are the originators and the advocates of digital disruption. Disruption's the norm. Disruption's a great thing. But big tech now faces disruptors in their own markets. And their responses to instigate a series of buy and kill mergers and operations. Buy the nascent technology and either hide it within its app or within its own platform, or kill it stone dead so nobody sees the light of day. And they can only do this because of the amount of cash that's available to them and the amount of credit that they're able to access. The consolidation of size means that the businesses themselves can behave like monopolies. To the extent that Faraha says, well, if you've got 50% of all of the gains in stock markets that come from the Silicon Six, then tech companies are the markets. There's no such thing as a market outside of technology. They have circumvented the market-based system. The platform has become the market. Just that the stock price is just the valuation of the market, of the platform. So not only are they monopolies in that they monopolize people in time and space, but now they've started to look like monopolies from an economic sense as well. And they can use that power over policymakers, with the exception of probably China. But there is a tension between Chinese platforms and the state. There is a tension that exists between platforms in the West, but the relationship is skewed, is that the platforms seem to hold more power than the state. And I don't know if any of you ever watched Mark Zuckerberg in front of the American Senate asking questions or answering questions about Facebook and its capacities to disrupt, is that it was clearly evident that Senate had no idea what they were talking about, to the extent that Zuckerberg was just confused by them. Knowledge, remember, information is powerful. In order to be able to effectively discuss platforms and the power of big tech, one needs to have the data in order to be able to do it, and understand the data, the technology, in order to be able to do it. And it's clearly evident that policymakers don't. So Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Microsoft have announced 19 deals this year. That was at May of this year. Sorry, May of last year. Representing the fastest pace of acquisitions to date since 2015. And buy and kill, Instagram is a buy and kill acquisition. So was not WeChat, the other one, WhatsApp. It's a buy and kill acquisition. That it's proved useful because of the different demographics is the only reason why it's still successful or still being utilized. But there's just some examples of various acquisitions that have occurred in the last few months. Google have acquired glasses maker North for 180 million. Amazon acquires an autonomous driving startup Zoox for 1.2 billion. 1.2 billion for a startup. Nobody else can afford these kinds of prices. But the tech businesses are driving the prices up because they're competing with each other. Microsoft acquires a UK Greek-based Softomotive for 100 million. And these are ideas, nascent technologies. These are not viable concerns that are being bought. Now, of course, the proprietors of these businesses, the entrepreneurs, could always say no, couldn't they? But when somebody weighs 100 million in front of your eyes, you think, oh, hang on a minute. In fact, in the book Googled, it is reported that the two inventors of the Google algorithm nearly sold it for $1 million. Imagine that. But it seems to be part and parcel of the overall strategy of the platforms. And it's because of the fact that they've got money and access to credit that other businesses just don't have. They're monopolies. They're becoming more like economic monopolies. Increasing corporate market power with increasing profitability and market concentration it gives you increasing market power. Okay, and the platform businesses get increasing profitability and market concentration. They've got high levels of market power. And it leads to a lesser requirement to innovate, because why innovate? Well, you're buying what we're providing anyway. The next generation of iPhone, it's not an innovation, is it? Slightly bigger, slightly smaller, slightly thinner, different security on it. It's not really an innovation. What we're seeing is increasing profitability and increasing concentration through acquisition, mergers and acquisitions. It means that big firms become bigger, and the biggest firms are the tech firms, and they're the biggest ones of all. And they're the disruptors, but they like to disrupt other people's markets, not necessarily their own. So the European Union has started to target big tech with hit lists facing tougher rules. And of course, big tech is, for the most part, fighting back, but it's also fighting back by utilizing the American government and its capacity to be able to lobby. So the European Union, which is trying to legislate and control the big technologies and the influence that big technologies are having over European society, but also European business, because this really is an issue about the influence that big tech has got within European societies, but also about the amount of tax that they are not paying. But the Americans are very supportive of the big tech businesses. There is an acknowledgement of criticisms within the US, but it's small in comparison to the sort of like the worship, almost the religiosity that sits behind the potency and the authority of big tech in the US. And so the big tech firms have been able to get support from the American administration, which is not insignificant. Schumpeter warned against monopolies and what he referred to as monopoly fatalism. He recognized that the most important long-term competitive pressure comes from new products cannibalizing incumbent businesses through marked product quality improvements. In other words, innovation stimulates the economy. Well, big tech as monopolies are able to push against disruption in their own economies. And we've seen that in the increase in the number of companies. This is from the US. And it's the blue line that you're looking at, and the amount of new corporations that are being created. It's been in a steady decline since the 1980s. And it would appear that Schumpeter was right, is that we are living in a world of big tech-driven platform monopoly fatalism.